going to do my whole recap of the course first, and then we're going to go back, and we're going to segue from the recap somehow into Hamid Nafisi and post-colonial filmmaking, and then we'll just talk a little bit. Fair enough? Okay. So, but before I do my recap, where do you think you guys are? Do you think you guys have actually absorbed some of the theoretical material, have a better sense of how to look at film through different, oh God, yeah, I can't even see you. Come here. Some of that, I mean, have actually understood how different theoretical lenses completely reshape. After which paper? The midterm paper. Yeah, that different theoretical lenses shape the way you watch film completely differently than if you watch film without actually thinking theoretically about them. You have, yeah?
Yes.
Good. One of the things that I try to do in the course outline and across the course of the semester is give you not just the sort of major theories of major film theories as they emerged chronologically as they emerged, beginning with the French. Remember the French theorists, the early French theorists, all through major Soviet montage theorists, the German theorists, cultural criticism, genre criticism, auteur criticism, feminist criticism, semiotics and psychoanalytical criticism, finally ending up with the third world stuff and the post-colonial stuff. And it seemed kind of appropriate to me to end the course where the two courses you're taking actually come together in perhaps some interesting ways, right? So some of the post-colonial criticism should be resonating with Aisha's class, yes? Yeah. But the larger point that the course was trying to make, and whether it was successful in making it or not, I'm not entirely sure, is that you can actually use these kinds of theoretical lenses to read not just film, but any set of media texts, right? So that these theoretical positions, these theoretical articulations of the way visual media actually operate in their relation to spectators, in their cultural context, in their historical location, in their geographical context, that the theoretical positions can be applied with varying degrees of varying degrees of depth and accent, as Hamid Nafisi would say, in relation to films, television, media texts such as newspapers, not just visual medium but also textual medium, literary theory, that the theoretical trajectory of film theory and film writing actually follows the theoretical trajectory of almost all literary theory in the 20th century, literary and cultural theory in the 20th century. It emerges these kinds of articulations like the French articulations of trying to pinpoint what is sublime and beautiful in film, what is specific, right, media specific to film text as opposed to a literary text or a photographic text, or a radio text for that matter. Through certain kinds of more scientific, systematic applications of theoretical positions like the Soviet montage theorists and the way the Soviet montage theorists were trying to influence spectatorship and the ways in which people looked at film, right? The ways in which people looked at and responded to film texts, through the sort of counter arguments to the montage theorists that were offered by realist theorists, specifically by Bazin and his school, and to a certain extent by people like Bela Balazs and even Rudolf Arnheim to a certain extent. Ali, hurry up, sit. We're recording. I won't be able to see you there. Sit here. The advent of realism as a signature style, the ways in which film changed from its essentially experimental and silent nature through the advent of the talkie and the way in which sound, the audible sound of language in film completely transformed how films were made and the ways in which people started theorizing around film, the articulations of film as a language, the the different ways in which people wanted to make sense of film in the ways that we make sense of spoken or written language, that all of those articulations are in many ways specific to their historical moment, and they emerge at certain times in response to larger cultural and historical historical factors that revolve around how art is seen and how art is considered in relation to the society in which it is produced, right? So in many periods in the 20th century, art is consistently denigrated as an elitist activity, as an activity that does not necessarily speak to the people. With the Soviet montage theorists, it's an attempt to take an artistic practice and make it available to the people, or to use it as a propaganda tool in order to activate the people to rebel against certain kinds of oppressions. There has been through the 20th century a consistent prejudice against art and artistic practice, right? And many of the theoretical positions articulated by many of the writers that we read this semester are an attempt to make art to sort of recover art from the kinds of insults that are leveled against it, right? The kinds of insults leveled against it by sociologists, kinds of insults leveled against it by politicians, and certainly the kinds of insults even leveled against it by parents of students who want to go and study art as a thing to do with their lives, as opposed to, you know, being a doctor, being a lawyer, being a businessman, which is, you know, one of the kinds of central vocational preferences that parents prefer for their children, not just mine, not just yours, mine as well. So many of the theories are an attempt to locate the artistic practice of film and the artistic and artwork itself in a place, a culturally important, socially important place, to make art relevant in a sense, and to say that art making and art practice is crucially important to the development of any society in any nation in any given historical moment, right? So is this making sense so far? Good. So in many ways, I mean, some of the theorists, like the Soviet montage theorists, approach it from a different point of view. Bazin's understanding of art and the film as an artwork, right, to actually make claims about film as an artwork separate from the commercializing impulses of film once talking films emerge in the 20s and 30s, as an attempt to actually place film on a higher level than regular daily social practice, and to recover film from the commercial impulses of an emerging studio system, not just in the US, but also the emerging studio systems in the UK and in France and in Germany. The ways in which film then becomes both a high art practice and a low art practice, right? The commercial films that emerge from the studio system, separate or distinct from the sort of art films, or the second, what's his name? Solanas calls second film, right? The art films of the European art film as opposed to the Hollywood product. The ways in which that kind of, the kind of commercial film is then critiqued by people like Horkheimer and Adorno and the Frankfurt School, in the manner in which it projects a particular ideological position, and how that ideological position is forced on a generally apathetic public, and actually contributes to making that public apathetic. Right, that's partly what Adorno's critique is, that the culture industry actually creates apathetic subjects within a particular society, and that through the creation of apathetic subjects, these subjects then conform to certain modes of production, specifically capitalist modes of production that refuse any kind of critical analysis. And Adorno's critique and Adorno's attempt is to recover film and recover cultural practices from that kind of stultifying and homogenizing impulse in the commercial world, in the studio system. The manner in which certain kinds of later critics, like the genre critics, begin to classify and typify films according to certain groupings that include genre groupings, but also auteur groupings. The auteur critics are doing things similar to what the French critics were doing, which was to place the art maker and the art practice on a level above general social activity, right? That art is somehow better and more valuable than automotive repair or any of those kinds of activities. Um, and then further, and then I'm losing my place. Right. And then specifically the genre critics who attempt to actually look at the manner in which certain genres become popular at particular historical moments and why they become popular in relation to cultural and social circumstances in which they're produced. Right. So the melodrama, which reaches its peak in the 40s and 50s, and the manner in which the melodrama actually exposes certain kinds of fissures and ruptures and cracks within the ideological structure of a capitalist society in America specifically, and then articulates how the role of women, or women specifically within that society, have been suppressed, oppressed, repressed, abused, insulted, etc., and how the films themselves, especially the films of filmmakers like Douglas Sirk, actually begin to show how women can respond against, or respond or fight against, or talk back to, in a certain sense, the particular ways in which their roles are being defined for them by cookie-cutter Hollywood directors and studios, and then finally the ways in which certain kinds of identity critiques of film, feminist critiques, and then later race critiques of film, post-colonial critiques of film, gay and lesbian critiques of film, actually begin to articulate a very different kind of understanding of how film functions, both ideologically in its spectatorial position in relation to the people who look at it, and how it actually forms identity through the very production and showing of these films, so that films actually normalize certain kinds of identity positions simply in the processes through which these identity positions are created and shown. So if, for example, you show a film in which a strong woman or a particularly dominant woman or dominating woman achieves her liberation in the context of a stultifying or oppressive masculine or patriarchal practice, that process actually has both cultural and ideological impact, is the argument. That's part of the argument that the feminist film critics are making, and part of the argument that the theorists and critics around melodrama are making, like Christine Gledhill and Thomas L. Saesser, that the films actually do certain kinds of cultural work around political and ideological positions, that towards the end of the semester, we almost entirely began focusing, pretty much from Adorno on the manner in which film works as a cultural practice and as a social practice, as well as an aesthetic practice. That the aesthetic, the cultural, the ideological, and the social are inextricably linked, and that you cannot actually ultimately separate one from the other. That the aesthetic practice has an ideological agenda behind it. So Maya Deren, when she chooses to do the things she does with her experimental film work, has everything to do with breaking free of a certain kind of formal strategy, formal conventional strategies of Hollywood narrative filmmaking, how you put a story together in order to break one's relationship to the conventional forms, structures, and strategies of filmmaking and narrative construction. Right? The ways in which exilic filmmakers and diasporic filmmakers, the ones that Hamid Nafisi talks about, similarly use different kinds of aesthetic strategies borrowed from perhaps some high art movements, borrowed from the montage theorists, borrowed from Brecht primarily, in order to break certain kinds of narrative understandings and expectations in the way in which you watch films. So ultimately, all of these theories are addressing how you watch, why you watch, what you see, why you see it, how you see it in the way that you see it, and how those things might be, in an ideal universe, different. Okay? Some of the critics are actually advocating in their manifestos for specifically different kinds of filmmaking. That's what Maya Deren does, that's what Laura Mulvey does, which we didn't really talk about, we didn't really read either. But the feminist critics are actually addressing particular ways, and the feminist critics were perhaps the first group of identity-inflected critics to begin taking apart the Hollywood narrative structures, Hollywood narrative systems of structure, what they call classic Hollywood film. What is a classic Hollywood film, right? How does it tell its story? Taking apart the very mechanisms through which the story is created and made, subjecting it to certain kinds of ideological, psychoanalytic, and identity-inflected criticism, taking it apart, breaking it apart, and demonstrating the ways in which these films both created certain kinds of ideological belief structures and reinforced certain kinds of already existing mainstream conventional ideological belief structures, and the ways in which these films actually also contain the seeds of their own rupture, the seeds of their own contradiction, so that there are sequences or scenes or moments in these films that actually demonstrate exactly the opposite of what the narrative is attempting to do. Right? So in some ways, Minority Report does exactly that. In some ways, some of the melodramas, especially the Douglas Sirk melodramas, do exactly that. Far From Heaven does exactly that. What are some of the other things that we saw? That the aesthetic practice, I have the whole list here, right? That the aesthetic practice itself and the ways in which that practice is actually articulated on celluloid or in digital technology on the screen actually matters. This is the part of the point that the theorists are trying to make. That the way in which one makes a film, the way in which one thinks about a film, and the way in which one talks about a film actually matters, partly because the underlying assumption is that film is a global, ubiquitous medium that we all participate in, that at some point in our lives, right, at least for even lower middle class and in some cases working class people, film is the place you go. Film is the aesthetic practice you see, right? Even more so than television. That you don't really, people who can't even afford to buy televisions may be able to afford to buy a film ticket, a ticket to the movies, and they will go and see it. And the things that they see on the screen will either reinforce or combat or butt up against the way their structures of belief. Some films will be more conscious of this than others. Other films will actually completely hide the mechanisms through which they project their ideological formations and constructions. Okay? So, guys, please interrupt me when you want to ask me a question.
The films that we used in the course that you used,
yes,
were generally examples of filmmakers or of practitioners who were aware of what they were doing.
Not entirely. Some, but not entirely, right? In some cases, they're entirely aware of what they're doing, right? Hitchcock is certainly aware of what he's doing in Rear Window. But Hitchcock is certainly not aware of his own ideological biases about secondary female characters in his films, right? That there are many, many feminist critiques of Hitchcock in the context of how he portrays these secondary women. In Rear Window, the Grace Kelly character, right, and also the other woman in the film, the actor whose name has gone out of my head, right, the woman who he rejects, the woman who he doesn't actually, who loves him, but he will not, who he cannot love back because he's enamored by this enigmatic, mysterious beauty who Grace Kelly is, right? That Hitchcock is not really aware of how he is constructing femininity in the context of his film, right? That film is constructed in relation to the male gaze, and and that's part of Laura Mulvey's argument, is that in the context of viewership, Hitchcock makes his films for men, okay? And that these women are objects to be gazed at and to be enjoyed by men in the theater, but not by women, right? That the women really have that women have very few points of entry into a Hitchcock narrative.
No, but what if he was aware?
Yeah, but he wasn't. I mean, you may want him to be aware, you may want him to be a better filmmaker or a more ideologically aware filmmaker than he was, but he wasn't. He really wasn't. Okay? And part of the reason for that is that, every filmmaker has his own blind spots. Every filmmaker has particular blindnesses and that they are. So even in the films which we would consider today as classic films, as masterful and even that word is a problematic word, right? We could say mistressful examples of filmmaking, that even in those films there are particular blind spots. There are particular ways in the filmmaking where filmmakers are not really aware of the ideological or cultural social work that the film actually does, right? The social effect, the media effect that it has.
Are there any examples of films which are, which have no blind spots?
Of course not. Because we all have our own biases and prejudices and right? But that's part of the fun of it. Part of the fun of it is to actually watch these films and to recognize what the filmmakers do accomplish and also what they don't accomplish, right? You don't necessarily dismiss films out of hand simply because in this particular area of filmmaking they are particularly blind or particularly ignorant or unaware of their own thinking processes. Right? One of the huge scandals around a particular film that occurred in recent times was Jonathan Demme's Silence of the Lambs. And the criticism and the controversy around in Silence of the Lambs was around the Jane Gum character, the transvestite serial killer. And the critique was that in commercial Hollywood fare, the only time you ever saw gay characters or transsexual characters was in these kinds of deviant positions where they performed certain kinds of horrific acts, whereas where the normal characters in all of these films were predominantly heterosexual characters. That was the big scandal around Silence of the Lambs. So what does Jonathan Demme do next? Because in some ways, under the smarting influence, as in the influence of this critique, which was pretty vocal and vociferous when the film came out, the very next film he made was Philadelphia, which was one of the first AIDS films that came out in Hollywood. And it had a remarkable reception, and in some ways, Jonathan Demme redeemed himself in the eyes of the gay and lesbian community, which is, really kind of crap, because Philadelphia is also not a film that actually, Philadelphia does a different kind of work. Doesn't do the same kind of thing that Silence of the Lambs does, but it is still conventionally constructed Hollywood narrative, right? It doesn't actually question the manner in which certain kinds of identity formations are reflected on a screen, okay? And Philadelphia, if you've seen any of you seen the film? Is really all about the Denzel Washington character, the straight lawyer, and not about the guy who's dying of AIDS, which is the Tom Hanks character. Okay? There are many other kinds of films that, in fact, critique, the very narrative that Philadelphia puts together. One of the other ways in this, the ways in which women have been handled in film. Any of you seen North Country? The film about the female factory workers who sue the factory for lower. Who sue a factory because they are abused, harassed by the men who work in the factory. They take the factory. This one woman takes the factory to court, and she is represented, of course, by this handsome hero played by Matthew McConaughey, and the women all look like bull dykey factory workers. So there's a way in which that film constructs a particular kind of ideological understanding of women who work in factories with heavy machinery, separate from, so they don't have an actress like Sharon Stone in the factory. They have Charlize Theron in the factory, or they have Frances McDormand in the factory, right? Not particularly attractive according to certain kinds of standards or models of American beauty, right, which is a separate film which we'll talk about perhaps. But it was supposed to be a feminist film. It was a feminist film because this was one of the first strikes around women's women's right to work in situations where they were being paid, where they were traditionally not accepted, right, or at least not accepted in the post-war period, because women did all this work during World War II, especially in America. They all made bombs, and Rosie the Riveter is a very famous ad from World War II, in which you have this very beautiful woman with a bandana holding a wrench in her hand, and she was known as Rosie the Riveter, doing her part for the war effort. right? But then in the 1970s, all these women had to, right through the Eisenhower 50s, they all went back to the home. They moved out to the suburbs, like they do in the Douglas Sirk melodramas, and they become very good housewives, right? The kind of issues that the film Mona Lisa Smile attempts to get at, right? Who are we training these? What are we training these women to be, right? Why are these women going to places like Wellesley when, in fact, Wellesley is a glorified finishing school, as opposed to a place where women can actually learn or be empowered? Those kinds of issues.
So in 15 years, they voluntarily went back from working to become a housewife?
Well, yeah, because they lost all their jobs after World War II because the men came home. The men came home from the war. So the men needed jobs, and they also got married. And women's traditional place is, right, making beds and cooking khana and having children. So there was a huge shift in the workforce in the US after World War II, which was solidified during the Eisenhower 50s in the diaspora from the urban environment into the suburbs, right? The creation of major suburbs in the US happens predominantly in the 50s. After which women are codified, classified according to their role as housewives, as mothers, as daughters within a particular social structure that valorizes women who do that kind of work as opposed to women who do other kinds of work, right? The Jane Wyman character in All That Heaven Allows, right, is a problem in that society specifically because her husband has died and she has not remarried. So the only way she can re-enter that social structure is by remarrying, and by remarrying someone appropriate for that society, who happens to be A, older than her, B, well established, C, not interested in sex, right? And who makes his formal marriage proposal like it's a business contract. Remember the little scene at the door? Whereas Rock Hudson is, the man of the earth, the person who lives life as he sees fit, without any constraints, without any thought to social decorum or social appropriateness or the rules by which the society runs, and who is essentially lives outside that social structure. And Jane Wyman has to make a choice, and the choice she makes is for liberation and freedom, as opposed to living a stultifying and suffocating life. But the larger issue that, in fact, Douglas Sirk never questions in the film is that she has to get married in the first place, right? There's no real reason why she has to get married from our perspective, but in that world, right, she had to get married. In order to secure any kind of place for her in society, she had to remarry.
All this, I'm just coming up with this term, social film theorization.
Yeah.
Seems to be looking for an ideal film, which seems impossible.
Well, it's not that it's looking for an ideal film, right? Some of the manifestos, yes, are actually saying film should be this and not that, right? You've all seen Independence Day, right? Independence Day, we talked about this a little bit, but remember, Independence Day is the kind of film that articulates American hegemony as an American ways of life and American customs, American understandings of what national liberation should look like, right, as ideal for global practice, as if somehow by the end of the film, every day for Independence Day for the whole world is now going to be on July 4th. The film was specifically timed to be released on it was released on July 2nd, 2 days before July 4th in America. And liberation at the end from aliens, from this species that came from some other planet in order to destroy Earth, has somehow galvanized everybody to come together in brotherhood and harmony, in the words of those idealistic, nostalgic John Lennon songs, in order to make the world anew in America's image, right? As if America's image is the thing to be emulated by everybody. And as if Hollywood filmmaking practice is the practice to be emulated by everybody, okay? And these manifestos, specifically, Ana Lopez, when she's talking about talking back to Hollywood, right? Shefuni, when he's talking about the different stages of third world filmmaking, assimilationist, combative, and I can't remember his last category, but you remember what I'm talking about, right? And even the manner in which Hamid Nafisi, when he characterizes three forms of filmmaking, he talks about third world filmmaking. He talks about exilic, diasporic, and ethnic. Right? That all of these writers are beginning to talk about how Hollywood has exerted a kind of hegemonic practice, global hegemonic practice, and that the manner in which stories are told, the subjects, hi, come on in, yes, hurry up. The manner in which stories are told, the subjects of those stories themselves, the ways in which those subjects are actually shown to us, represented in film, right, have all been determined by a kind of storytelling practice, visual storytelling practice that emerges in the studio system in America. And that those ideological values that are in some ways integrated into the Hollywood film then become sort of values that are spread globally. It's what you guys have been reading about in Aisha's course in relation to cultural imperialism, right? How does cultural imperialism operate, and how can one fight against it, or how can one actually articulate an indigenous voice or a third world voice separate from or distinct from the manner in which those voices have been in some ways appropriated and co-opted by a filmmaking system that comes from the West, primarily from Los Angeles. Okay? Part of the problem with those kinds of critiques is this, right? Is there's an assumption being made that all Hollywood films are the same, that all Hollywood films articulate the same ideology, and all Hollywood films participate in the same social formation. And there are plenty of films that come out of Hollywood that actually energetically and specifically critique the very forms of capitalism that through which Hollywood operates, right? So, some of those filmmakers are independent filmmakers like Kelly Reichardt, remember Wendy and Lucy? Some of those filmmakers are national treasures who at the same time critique the very forms that they have inherited, like Robert Altman. Some of those filmmakers are filmmakers who actually participate within the system and yet understand the dangers of that system, like Steven Spielberg, right? And then some of those filmmakers simply refuse to participate in the system at all, but that those films still come out of or are distributed by a Hollywood machine, right? Certain films, certain recent independent films like Margot at the Wedding, or if you've seen that, which if you haven't seen it, you really should see it. It's great. What's the name of that film? It'll come to me. Right? Even a film, right? What is Steven Spielberg's, what is Minority Report about? Minority Report is about the dangers of a Big Brother society in which crime is regulated through this act of precognition, right? Where these three children, we don't know whether they're actually related to each other or not. We're assuming that they're not necessarily related to each other, that the twins are not related to Agatha, but that these children have been appropriated into a system, right? Appropriated into a system with no sense of with no acknowledgement that these are human beings, or no acknowledgement that they are actually people who have rights, who should be treated with a certain kind of humanity, and who are then plugged into a set of machines in order to do this thing, that to predict crimes and to prevent crimes before they occur, right? Very much of it, a film that's very much of its time, specifically in the context of the Bush Doctrine and preemptive force, exerted around the world in order to prevent nations from doing things that the Bush administration thinks that they will do, or that now the Obama administration thinks that they would do, right? There's very little distinction between the foreign policy of the Democrats and the foreign policy of the Republicans. But that's very much what that film is about. At the same time, right, and about this one heroic young figure who then, because he is implicated in that system itself, right? The cop who then becomes the outlaw, who is seen to be someone who is then accused by the machine of being a potential murderer, who then goes out to try and stop the murder, who's manipulated into killing somebody, who then refuses to kill that person, who dies anyway, right? The convolutions of this plot, who then at the end of the film reemerges in a free American society, rid of pre-crime and rid of the father of pre-crime, who is the corrupt figure of the film, right? Now happily ensconced in his country home with his pregnant wife, right? Where the wife is now going to replace the child that was lost, that started the whole film off in the first place. Okay? So this idea of returning to the womb, or returning to the home, or returning to the place where some kind of original sin forced you into behaving in certain ways, and then renouncing that original sin, and his renunciation of that original sin is to stop taking drugs and to get back with his wife, right? Is a way for closure to be achieved in the context of a set of American values that even Steven Spielberg puts into his film without necessarily thinking carefully about it. And look at the way the female characters in that film are structured, right? There are 3 female characters in that film. There's the mother of pre-crime, who is now a recluse, right? She sits in her garden and tends to her vicious plants who could kill you at any second, right? You have the wife, who is a cipher. The only thing she does is function as a wife. She functions as an estranged wife who has one important plot moment, literally only one important plot moment, where she frees him from the halo, right? When he's already in prison, she goes and she holds a gun to the guy's head and she frees him from that place. And the most enigmatic character of all, Agatha, about whom we know absolutely nothing. The only thing we know about Agatha is she is a screen on which other people's lives are constantly projected. Right? So it's not like Steven Spielberg is doing any radical work in the film, except in the context of critiquing a certain kind of political ideology that was already being critiqued in American society before he even made the film. Okay? So what I'm trying to say is that you know, but how did I get here? That filmmaking, that within Hollywood itself, there are many different kinds of films being made, and many different kinds of ideological formations articulated in those films, many different ideological positions, many different aesthetic formations, aesthetic mechanisms or strategies that are deployed in order to make those films, right? So the aesthetic of, say, the narrative style that someone like Christopher Nolan uses is very different from the narrative style that someone like Catherine Bigelow uses, for example. Catherine Bigelow is the director of The Hurt Locker, right? That they use different kinds of aesthetic strategies to make larger sort of political or ideological or social statements about the condition of society in relation to American culture. Okay? And that the argument, the critique that the third world filmmakers articulate is that then these films are exported globally, that they dominate the box offices of countries where these films have not been made, and about whom these films are not, that the subjects of these films are not the subjects who go and see them in these globally disparate countries, right? The people who go and see Inception in Pakistan, or the people who go and see Minority Report or The Hurt Locker in Pakistan, right, are not in any sense seeing themselves on the screen. But what they are doing is they're absorbing a set of values, right? This is what Adorno argues in his critique, that they're absorbing a set of values that are structured into the narrative itself. And that by absorbing those sets of values that are structured into the narrative itself, by engaging, by participating in the process of cultural imperialism, they are by degrees, not necessarily overnight, but by degrees, actually erasing their own cultural heritage, or their own cultural sensibility, or their understanding of their own identities in the context of their own countries. What is the value of a working class Senegalese mother going to see a film like Inception? Seriously, right? There isn't a and you know, that seems to be like an absurd category of identity to put forward, but you know, this is what happens, right? What is the point of it? Why see it? If all you're going to do is watch a great bunch of great special effects and sit there for 3 hours and be entertained and walk out back into your miserable world after those 3 hours, right? But the process of watching it has also then reinforced certain value systems, right? Certain value systems in relation to children, because the entire film is about a search for two kids who he hasn't seen in however many years because he's in exile, right? And an attempt to get rid of this endless guilt, right? This never-ending guilt about planting an idea in his wife, Marion Cotillard's mind, that led to her suicide. And the entire film is an elaborate structure, right, in order to explore those two psychological states in relation to Leonardo DiCaprio's character. It's an excuse to do that. And it does it magnificently. I'm not saying it doesn't do it magnificently. It does. He's a great filmmaker in the sense that he knows how to manipulate the language of film and the materials of film in order to create the effects he does. But, yeah.
Even if you know that you are going, when you are watching a film,
Yeah.
you are getting their values and you are appropriating it in yourself.
Yes.
But again, there's nothing one can do, whether you like it or not. You will eventually go on that road.
But no,
Even if you understand it.
well,
Because they are,
well, I think that part of the process of actually reading theory is an attempt to arm you with a set of lenses that can actually refuse to be assimilated into those kinds of narratives, okay? There's an entire a branch of film theory that we haven't read that talks about how spectators are sutured into theory. Literally, you know what suturing is, right? Suturing is a surgical term through which, where a surgeon actually stitches together the two sides of a scar, a surgical incision. Right? The idea, and it's a psychological term that's used by Lacan and before him by Freud. And the idea is that the process of the narrative actually sutures you, stitches you into the world of the film. That the processes of certain kind of narrative filmmaking, right, asks you to enter into the world, and then by entering into the world implicates you and makes you complicit in the very actions and activities that the characters on screen perform. Okay? So, for example, you've all seen that other Roland Emmerich film, 2012? Okay? Who is the villain of that film? There are villains in that film, right? There are specifically characterized villains in that film, all of whom actually have one redeeming moment, because that's, you know, classical Hollywood filmmaking.
first is the Russian.
The Russian guy is one of the villains in the film, right? And why is he a villain in the film?
Because he's very mean, he's very rich.
That's it, because he has money. And that because he uses his money for his own selfish purposes. But he doesn't just use it for his selfish purposes. He actually also pays for his children, right? It's not just for himself. He could very easily have just saved himself and not his kids, but he saves his kids, right? Yes, he's willing to leave his girlfriend behind because he discovers that she's been cheating on him with his chauffeur, right? Both of which characters die at the end of the film because they have transgressed certain kinds of social norms, right? They've had an adulterous affair. Well, adulterous only in the context that this Russian has been keeping a mistress and she's only been staying with him because he gives her, you know, presents, jewels, okay? But who else are villains in this film? Why isn't the president of the United States a villain? He is, isn't he in the context of the film a villain? He authorizes the assassination of any individual who discloses what they're doing, right? The secret being that the world is going to end. He orders their assassination. Why isn't he a villain? But he's not portrayed as a villain, and he's not portrayed as a villain specifically because Danny Glover plays him, right? And Danny Glover couldn't be a villain if you hit him on the head with it, right? He's a soft-spoken black man. He's specifically a black man in order to give him a certain kind of moral standing in the world of that film, separate from the way in which a white man who ordered those assassinations might be seen, right? So that race actually determines how you respond to a particular character in the context of a certain behavior that is ultimately hidden or erased, right? Seen as necessary. These deaths are collateral damage. They are necessary. The director of the Louvre, right, who is killed in a Paris tunnel, the same tunnel that we are told where Diana died. Why we are told that, I have no idea, right? In the context of the narrative, it has no meaning. Okay? Who else turns out to be a villain? All the characters who die are in some ways villains in this film, right? The Chinese guy who works on the arcs, right? The reason he is a villain because he selfishly, initially refuses to take John Cusack and his family on the truck because he won't be able to smuggle them in, or he doesn't want to try and smuggle them in, right? And until his parents insist. Because the parents insist, they are saved. Because he refuses, he dies, right? So certain forms, and you don't even see this while you're watching the film, right? You simply watch the narrative and you are immersed in the narrative. But certain kinds of values in relation to behavior, moral judgments about behavior are articulated through the narrative and conform to certain kinds of conventional understandings of how people behave, right? That's the way you're sutured into narrative, right? Yes, but if you learn how to read film this way, right? If you learn how to use the theory or activate the theory marshal the theory in order to understand how film does what it does, you can resist it, right? Part of this is about resisting the ways in which film actually operates on you. Some of you have told me that you will never watch films the same way again. And honestly, my response to that is good. Seriously, because otherwise all you do is you go through life gaping at these spectacles and absorbing and agreeing with the systems and the structures of value that are placed or sutured into the narrative, right? That are put into the narrative, and not necessarily critiquing analytically or thinking analytically about what these films are doing. That doesn't mean you shouldn't appreciate them or enjoy them, right? I enjoy lots of films that I think are ideologically abominable. Lots of films. Because films are fun, right? You can appreciate the craft of a film, still disagree with its ideology and its politics, right? And arrive at some kind of complex understanding of how it operates, why it operates in that way, and how beautiful it is all at the same time. How well made it is. How well constructed it is. Right? That's part of the point, part of the agenda. And if the course accomplished that in any way for you guys, I will be very happy. Did it? Okay. I mean, you're not just saying that. Okay. Because, one of the reasons to study film is because everybody sees it, everybody watches it. And today it emerges from every nation, except perhaps Somalia. But it still emerges from every nation. Every nation has its own filmmaking practice. Every nation attempts to create representations of itself on the screen because film is such an international phenomenon. And because films can now be beamed from one place to another via satellite or through Vimeo or YouTube, right? That the transfer of film from one geographical location to another is almost instantaneous. You don't need to send cans, celluloid in cans, hundreds of thousands of miles, or thousands of miles, I should say, in order to screen it, right? Which is what used to happen. You used to have to wait for, 6 or 8 cans of film stock to arrive at Bambino Cinema so you could sit and watch Lawrence of Arabia. But you don't have to do that anymore, right? You go to L'Arabe, Adil downloads it from, wherever he downloads it from, and you buy it, and you watch it. You watch it in your home.
So what will happen now? Now it is very easy for us to get the access.
So what will happen now in what sense?
Now, how would we use when it's very easy for me as a person
Yeah.
to get it from or to download it
Yes.
from YouTube?
And you're also watching it in a different context, right? You used to have to go to the movie theater to watch a film. Okay? You don't have to do that anymore. Now you can pop it in, and then with the advent of television, you used to be able to see every Saturday night in Karachi. At least when I was a kid, there used to be Saturday night cinema, and we used to get to watch Saturday night cinema sometimes if we were good kids. Seriously. And Saturday night cinema was almost always an English language film. It was never a Hindi film, never a Bollywood film, and never a Pakistani film either, right? If you wanted to go see Barbara Sharif in her skimpy outfits prance around the screen, you had to go to Bambino or Nishat or one of those cinema houses and drive in. There used to be a drive-in and 2 drive-ins in Karachi. So the process, the manner in which one watches films has changed, right? And there's a difference in watching it in your sitting room at home in front of your television, right? Eating your dinner, answering your cell phone, sending text messages, slow looking up, looking down, looking up, from actually going into a darkened theater, right? Where you are deliberately put into an apathetic state by the conditions of the theater itself, right? Popcorn, food in your hand, comfortable seat to sit on, dark room, right? With a whole bunch of people who you don't know, so you have very little desire to talk to the person next to you unless you've actually gone on a date, in which case most of the time you're not even watching the film. The process of watching films has changed, and which means that the analytical processes will change as well. They will shift. Part of the process, part of the sort of the digital age has been to change the way we actually participate with the cultural objects that are produced in our societies and in other societies. Okay? Where it'll go from now, Ali, I have no idea. I'm not.
But now we have control.
We have a different kind of control. But yes, we do have control in a way that we never used to have control. Now you can stop the image and stare at it for 10 minutes and then move forward, as opposed to just having to watch something that was screening in front of you with no control over the process through which it was screened, right? You couldn't.
Now this is limiting their control. What we call Bollywood film industry. Now they cannot act the way they used to act.
Yes, but only if you actively participate in doing those things, right? If you don't actually stop the DVD and say, all right, let's look at this frame for 20 minutes and figure out what the hell is going on in this frame, right? If you imitate the same process of watching that you would do in a movie theater, right? You're not necessarily changing the way you watch, okay? You have the means available to you, but you are not actually actively participating in the act of looking. Right? This is some of this stuff we talked about a little bit last semester, like last spring, right? How you look, why you look, what you look for, right? Remember I said you look for 3 things in films, right? You look for yourself as you are, or you see yourself as you are, you see the person you want to be, you're the idealized version of yourself, and you see the person you are not, the other. And your response to film is almost entirely negotiated between those 3 identity categories in all of their complexity, right? Those are not simple categories, right? Who you are is not a simple category. Who you want to be is not a simple category, and who you are not is not a simple category. In many ways, film functions in that way as a mirror, right? Where you look at yourself, the manner in which you look at yourself and see yourself for the first time as someone not yourself. Right? You see yourself and you also see someone not yourself. Do you understand? Because you don't recognize, it's a form of misrecognition, is what Lacan says. The process of looking is always a form of misrecognition. Yes?
So, is there a culture other than tribal cultures which is oblivious of what film is?
Well, I can't even imagine that tribal cultures today are oblivious of film. I mean, if you're talking about cultures, tribes in the deep reaches of the Amazon Delta, or in Africa, or in places in the Far East, in certain islands in the Pacific, who have never actually had any human contact with the outside world, then yeah, maybe. But I think, I don't think that's even possible today anymore.
Or okay.
There's nowhere left to
Is there
explore,
a film
right?
culture which clearly articulates that there is very little influence of the mighty Hollywood?
Well, no, there isn't, right? Because all these indigenous film production, all of these sort of national cinemas that have been emerging over the last 20, 30, 40 years are in many ways responses to Hollywood, right? Are ways of actually looking at Hollywood and saying, this is not us. That's what Hamid Nafisi says, right? That these films actually attempt to say specifically, this is not us. Therefore, we have to make a film or engage in film practices that show us, tell our stories. Tell our stories in the way that we should be telling them, as opposed to the way Hollywood will tell them for us. Part of the problem with Hollywood is that Hollywood has actually made all sorts of exotic films about all sorts of exotic places in Hollywood terms, right? And completely restructured the manner of understanding or recognition in relation to those representations. So all of those endless Bob Hope road movies, right? Road to Singapore, there's even a road to, there's a road to, no, it's not Road to Karachi, but it's Road to Bombay or something. It's Road to something. No, it's a Bob Hope Bob Hope road movie. Train to Pakistan is a film, Indian film. But so that The Thief of Baghdad, right? Which was a very famous classic. How many of you ever saw The Thief of Baghdad? I actually went to see it at I don't know, one of those Capri or something, when I was a kid, right? With very artificial, turbaned, generically Middle Eastern characters, all played by American actors, right? So that even these Middle Eastern characters all had American accents. So somehow you began to think that people really should talk this way, right? And look this way. That the ideal way of looking at, the ideal way a Middle Eastern character should look is with this vaguely applied brown makeup, right? Darkened makeup, but with this perfectly enunciated language. Which is why Hamid Nafisi's term is so useful, right? When he talks about accented cinema, he's talking specifically about the ways in which language itself is accented across the third world. You had a question.
I forgot.
Okay.
No, yes. I was saying, you said Hollywood is telling us who we are, or they are making movies about us also.
Yeah.
And now national cinema is making movies to tell us actually who we are. So national cinema, our national cinema is making movies to tell us who we are actually.
Right. Or at least indigenous local directors are trying to do that. Yes. Story is about a family that comes out, that emerges from under the corrupting influence of this patriarchal Hakim figure, and then who make something of themselves, right? Starting out with the mother who cooks 1 handi a day for 3 people sitting on the street corner, and then ultimately ends up with a 5-star restaurant in the middle of Lahore named after her now dead daughter. Right? So it's not, this is the kind of fantasy narrative about how one can be successful in Pakistan. But what is this fantasy narrative actually? This is the typical structure of a melodrama, right? It uses the Hollywood melodrama to tell the story of a lower class family in Lahore. And it uses all of those tropes, right? All of those sort of minor narratives that include generational conflict, right? Especially in the context of father and daughters or father and son. It uses family conflict in the context of marriage, right? Whether the daughter can actually be allowed to marry the more liberal son from next door. It uses, it makes all sorts of moral statements about certain kinds of activities, including prostitution, right? where this one poor woman is demonized in some ways for doing the things she does, and also is seen in a sympathetic light because she's forced into it by this very corrupting figure, right? The pimp, the brothel owner, whose money is so dirty one can't even touch it, that one has to actually wash it with soap and water and then iron it before one can touch it. Right? There are all sorts of moral statements being made in that film, and they're not all negative. They're not all necessarily negative, right?
I just saw the positive thing in the end. The end of the movie, that they are now working.
There are all sorts of little minor things that happen in the film, like the fact that the son next door actually facilitates the liberation of the daughter, right? By allowing her to do the things she has to do in order to conform to her father's wishes, and at the same time helping her to get to the rock concert on the back of his motorbike in the parda, and then to shed it and then sing, right? The way in which that boy is saved by the hijra in the field is another moment in which certain kinds of kindnesses are articulated in the film from characters who are traditionally or conventionally seen as dirty or in some ways corrupt or unclean, right? And the ways in which, and finally, the large way in which Zainab actually stands up to her father and refuses, right? Refuses to let him kill that child. Those are all heroic acts, right? And they are seen as heroic acts and structured into the film as, it's not just negative. If it was just negative, the film wouldn't work. It actually would be, narratively it wouldn't work. But the narrative of this film conforms to every bad Bollywood melodrama you've ever seen. And those Bollywood melodramas come entirely out of Hollywood. Yeah.
How is Slumdog Millionaire different from any other movie which is made in India?
Not at all. Not at all.
It was made by Hollywood.
Danny Boyle.
And studio is Universal.
Yeah. Is it different? It's about a boy who makes it good, right? Who makes it good because of his previous horrible life experiences, so that each question is answered. The answer to each question revolves around a particular horrendous experience that he had growing up in the slums of Mumbai. Right? It's structured around that most horrible of all shows, the game show, in which one has this dream of striking it rich, right? That everybody can do it. Everybody can become a crorepati. And the manner in which the very form of the game show is corrupted not only by the host, but then facilitated by the police, right? Because it's the same argument that is actually being articulated in this new film called Anonymous, right? How could Shakespeare had written all these plays because he was an uneducated ignoramus from Stratford, the son of a glove maker? How could he have written these amazing things? It had to be an aristocrat with education, right? So the hypothesis put forward in the film is a hypothesis that's been around since the late 18th, early 19th century. That some aristocrat, Edward de Vere or the Earl of Oxford or even Queen Elizabeth herself, actually was the real authors of Shakespeare's plays, and they used Shakespeare's name in order to retain their anonymity. Right? Similarly in Slumdog Millionaire, right? How could he know the answers to these things? These are not unique narratives, and they are not specific to their environments. Okay? That these are narratives that come out of a long storytelling tradition that, in some cases, are exported from Western storytelling traditions, right? In some instances, are actually taken from Eastern traditions, Eastern epic and storytelling traditions, and then grafted into Western narrative structures. So, Miraner's film, Deepa Mehta's film, Fire, which tells the story of Rama and Sita in the context of a lesbian relationship between the two housewives, right? It takes the story of Sita, right, and the proving of Sita's chastity and her integrity and her honesty by making her walk through fire, that story, right? and grafts it into a narrative about lesbian liberation, feminist liberation from the control of these overbearing husbands, right? So that the relationship actually becomes an act of resistance. But the narrative style and structure of the film is not any more Indian than any other narrative, right? Even though Deepa Mehta makes it. Yeah.
All the ideological criticism seems to be working at one of the elements of film,
Yes.
which is the narrative itself.
Yes.
Are there any theoretical frameworks through which one can look at the images itself?
Sure. Maya Deren does that. Eisenstein does that.
And find ideology implied there?
Sure. Sure. That's part of what the semiotic analysis of film attempts to do, right? To look at the structure of the image itself and to see how the image itself articulates a particular ideological position. We did this in the spring, right? I didn't do it so much in this class, but that is what we did in visual culture. In fact, we spent a lot of time focusing on the very way in which the structure of an image articulates an ideological position, right? The very frames themselves.
Why is it that the sociological theorists seem to be looking at only narrative?
Because the sociological theorists don't know jack shit about art. Sorry. But they don't. They don't know how artwork gets made. Right? So their entire analysis of artworks is at the level of ideology, at the level of narrative, because narrative is the only thing they can work with. And the particular conventions, social conventions, that are put forward through the narrative. Okay? But they don't actually look at how narratives are constructed aesthetically. Right? How they begin, how they end, how they achieve closure, what kind of closure they achieved, what kind of narrative patterns emerge from the story itself, how a writer or a filmmaker or a theater playwright actually structures in a pattern of repeated behaviors or repeated images in order to create certain kinds of aesthetic effects that revolve around the pleasure of the spectator. Aesthetics is partly about pleasure, right? It's about how you enjoy artwork. And sociological theorists are not particularly interested in the pleasure you get from watching art or seeing art. Okay? For them, artwork is simply a social document that reflects a social world. Not that that argument is wrong or bad, it's limited. Okay? And what these theorists are trying to do, all of these theorists on some level, is trying to figure out how these two aspects of art making actually work together. The social context, the social world, and the aesthetic work. And how different aesthetic ways of making film, right, reflect different social formations and different ideological formations within any given society or culture.
I think we discussed it in Far From Heaven thing.
Yes.
That the sociological thing and the aesthetical thing, that the lady is wearing red going to the party.
Yes.
Dresses in every
In all that heaven allows. Yeah, right? Right? So that Jane Wyman is coded as an available woman because she's wearing that bright red dress and everybody else is in pastels or muted colors through that whole scene, right? And she stands out. She becomes available, and red signifies a certain kind of a sexual availability, which is then capitalized on by that horny married guy who has arrived at the party without his wife, who she rejects, right? And which later comes back to haunt her because that's the accusation made to her, against her, when she takes up with the younger guy, Rock Hudson, right? Who always wears earthy colors, right? That the aesthetic choices, whether it has to do with color or whether it has to do with framing or whether it has to do with the sequencing of images, right? Those aesthetic choices actually have symbolic meaning. We talked about this, right?
Try to notice the lightning of the movie.
Yeah.
Light effects.
Right, and we talked about how the lighting of that film works, right? We talked about how the outdoor scenes are lit, how the indoor scenes are lit, how in fact often the indoor scenes cast particular characters in shadow specifically to symbolically represent their.
Intentionally dramatic.
With Douglas Sirk, entirely intentional. Every part of it is intentional. With most filmmakers, it's intentional.
If it was not intentional, it would be in some parts. It was all over the film.
Yeah. Right. The way in which, remember Renoir's film Grand Illusion, right? The way in which Renoir specifically uses the camera in order to create patterns and relationships between scenes, right? So that he starts at one point and he pans across an entire room before you get to the central scene that he is going to shoot. Similarly, at the lunch scene, when they arrive when they're shot down and captured by the Germans, right? He pans across the whole room before he settles on Erich von Stroheim, and then Erich von Stroheim actually greeting the shot down warriors. Which is an effect he uses again in the castle when they're imprisoned in the castle, and effect he uses again when the soldiers, when the imprisoned soldiers are mustered in the courtyard. Repeatedly, the same camera pattern in order to create certain kinds of aesthetic relationships between one scene and another scene and another scene. But a sociological analysis is never going to work with that, right? Is never going to see how a filmmaker or a writer creates aesthetic patterns in order to draw your attention to certain kinds of social connections or symbolic connections between and among different scenes across the film. Right? Hitchcock does this. Hitchcock does this really well, right? With the framing and rear window. Yeah.
I was just saying that psychology is a social science and audience analysis is a psychological measurement thing. So sociology does measure semiotics.
Of course it does.
It does. So, the framing and the colors and everything are actually also measured through a sociological.
They are, but not in terms of, not in the aesthetic realm.
The uptake.
Yes. So when you were asked the question about audience response, right? When the Nahid's question in the exam paper, right? Audience response can be measured sociologically, and the things you are responding to are what the filmmaker has actually put into the film. But a sociological analysis is not going to actually try and take apart what that filmmaker has actually put into the film aesthetically. Sociologically, yes, but not aesthetically. And part of our pleasure in film is that kind of recognition. When you watch Seven, right? Part of the pleasure of Seven is recognizing all of the references that David Fincher has stuck into the narrative, right? That's an aesthetic pleasure. That's not a sociological pleasure.
What
Yeah.
you take apart of films
Yeah.
is, I mean, my general assumption is to look at it at its form and not the subject.
Yeah, but you're making an artificial distinction between the form and the subject. I know we do this in play analysis. We make this artificial distinction between form and the substance of a play, so that we can talk about form, right? And we did that here when we were talking about the montage theorists, so that we could talk about the form of a narrative. That's what Eisenstein does, right? But the distinction is entirely artificial, right? In good films, you cannot separate the form of a film from its subject matter, from the substance that it represents. In fact, it's like, remember I told you this, right? We talked about this in my office, and then I told you to take a bottle of water into class and pour it out and say, all right, this is water, and then this is water, right? That the form of the water is determined, that the water, or the way we perceive the water, is determined by the shape of the water bottle, okay? That it's inextricable. You cannot divorce those two things.
No, but see, you said the same thing. To experience even the subject or to look at the subject.
We experience it, yeah.
Happens through form only.
Of course it happens through form, but we also experience the form through the subject matter. We do, right? We experience the form of a tragedy through the substance that tragedy imparts to us. We experience the form of a comedy, of a melodrama, through the substance of the narrative.
But the practitioners, all art practitioners, it seems, it occurs to me that perhaps the form takes precedence in their practice.
Zishan, when artists actually sit down and say, artists don't sit down and say, all right, I'm going to write a tragedy and it is going to take this form. Well, certain playwrights in the 19th century used to do that, right? When Sardou wrote 800 plays according to a well-made play formula. But most artists don't do that, right? Most filmmakers don't do that. They see an image. They have an idea for a character. They see a particular location. They have a couple of lines, right? A couple of lines of dialogue get stuck in their head. And entire screenplays develop out of those small things, those very small things. And then, after those things develop, after those narratives are first written down, then they are worked on, then they are revised, then they are rethought, then they are put into certain kinds of patterns and arrangements. But artists don't work by starting with form, right? If they did, or even necessarily by subject, right? In many instances, for writers and for screenwriters and for filmmakers, the style and the substance of their films are determined by the trajectory the narrative takes in the process of being written. The first draft you write of anything, whether it's a short story or a screenplay or a playwright or a play, you have no idea where it's going to go. You just simply write the thing. Then you figure out where you got to, then you go back and you reshape it so that the things that you do at the beginning of the story are patterned so that you can get to the end of the story. Okay? Some writers even begin by writing the ending first. In fact, almost all mystery writers, murder mystery writers, begin by writing the ending first. And then write their way to the ending, so that they can actually pattern a sequence of events. And the most people who write cop shows for television, right, write the denouement first, the resolution first, and then structure in how the cops actually figured out who the murderer was. And then if you're making something like CSI, you put in endlessly ridiculous shots of people looking at evidence, right, in split frames and tripled frames and quadruple frames and, through glass and through mirrors and through reflections and close-up shots of tweezers and, those kinds of things, which is all filler. I mean, that's got absolutely nothing, but our experience of CSI is that, more so than the narrative, right? It's of all of the ways in which they maneuver or handle evidence. That's what the show is about. Everything else is an excuse, right? We know they're going to find out who committed the murder at the end of the show. In fact, it's predetermined by the form that they're using, the police procedural, the television police, episodic television police procedural. The interest of the show is, in fact, this cinematic form it takes, the way in which they particularly focus on different parts of different aspects of evidence collecting and evaluation, right? I find it incredibly boring, but some people don't. Some people think, wow, they can actually do that with evidence. And of course, they really can't do that with evidence because it's a television show, damn it.